Greetings, future master gardeners. Today, we are going to talk about basic landscape design. So, everybody has goals in landscaping. So, the first thing to do is organize these goals and develop the site for maximum use and pleasure. We also talk about curb appeal. So, we need to create a visual relationship between the house and the site. We also want to reduce landscape maintenance to a practical level. Now, to get ideas, a lot of people visit other yards or public gardens and they actually take pictures and stuff, or they go through magazines and books. You don't want to rush into something that you have to live with for years, especially when it comes to planting a tree, because hopefully your tree is going to live a long period of time. The hardest thing to do is make a budget and try to stay on it. As master gardeners, we tend to want one of everything, so that's going to be the most difficult thing to do. Okay, very important to know where you stand at the beginning. So the reason for that is that soil test. You want to know where your existing nutrient levels are. So the soil pH, it measures the acidity and the alkalinity. And the reason for this, we have plants that love to be in a more acidic soil, such as azaleas, camellias, or blueberries. And then we have the certain ones that are like a more alkaline soil. A soil pH of 7.0 is neutral. A soil pH below this is acidic. Most plants do best in a slightly acidic soil. Okay, the most important thing to do is evaluate the site. And on that, we have the main street. We want to know, of course, where's the resident sitting, but you also want to mention where all the hardscape is. So for instance, here's the driveway, sidewalks. Very important that you know where the sewer and the water lines are. And another thing, always understand where those underground electrical services come into the house. So you need to call that dig service before you plan on digging anything, just to keep from cutting those, fiber optic lines or anything like that, because that can get dangerous and expensive. We also want to notice the existing tree lines. Where are those existing trees on the property? Again, another very important thing is, what is the drainage on the site? Hopefully it's draining away from the home or the residence, because most people or plants do not like wet feet. So it's very important that we know how the water is draining away from the site. When you're assessing your landscape needs, again, we talked about drainage, how important it is. We're also going to talk about slope, because to get water away from the residence or from your planting beds, it's going to have to do with the amount of slope that you have. We need to concentrate on hardscape. And when I say hardscape, we're talking about patios, sidewalks, arbors, and decks. Outdoor fireplaces are really big now. Fire pits are great. And water features, a lot of landscapes now include those. And the biggest thing now is outdoor kitchens. So we need to plan for these. And this is going to come, the importance of this is going to come later on into the talk. Also, we need to assess the sun and shade options. As you know, certain plants thrive in sun, certain ones have to have shade. And a perfect example is hostas. Hostas would love, if you put a hosta out in the hot sun, it's going to cook to a crisp. So it's very important to know what type of plant you're planting, and is it a sun-loving plant? Is it a shade-loving plant? Maintenance, high versus low. If you're a type of person that doesn't like to do yard maintenance, you want to keep your landscape to a low maintenance. Or if you're like me and actually use gardening or as a therapy, I don't mind it because it's actually therapy for me, but a majority of people don't see it the same way I do. Irrigation is going to be very important. All plants are going to need moisture, so we need to plan on it. Are you going to have in-ground irrigation that pops up and is run by a controller, or are you going to be dragging that hose around with a sprinkler system? Okay, very important. When it comes to assessing your landscape needs, you might want to screen unwanted views and noises. So for instance, maybe your house, on a lot sits really close to another house. Well, you might want to think about really thick evergreen screening, not just for sight, but also for sound. And again, you also might have those neighbors that might have junk laying around, like cars on blocks, or, a deer gutting stand that you don't want to look at. So these are very important to keep in mind when you're actually planning your landscape. When you organize your space, you need to define the public areas, which most people think is the front part, versus the private areas, which are usually the back part of the residence. You also need to pay attention to the established service areas as needed. For instance, do you see this air conditioning unit? you know, when you're looking at your landscape and you're planning a landscape, if it's viewed from the public area, you might want to think about screening it with a fence or with evergreen shrubs. Or if that is sitting close to a patio that you're going to be entertaining on, you know, when that air conditioning service kicks on, it's going to make a sound. So you might want to plan for that. Also, you know, a lot of people have their waste cans sitting here in a private area. You might want to plan for that. Are they visible from the public viewing area? You might want to screen for it. A place where you store your like cushions on your outdoor furniture, or maybe a compost pile. You really don't want these in the public area. These are areas you want to more or less keep in a private area, and you want to plan for screening. Okay, on establishing viewing perspectives, you kind of realize where are the people viewing your landscape from the front. That's that curb appeal. If you look here, you notice the arrows going to the front, but most people don't realize when they're viewing their perspective in their back residence, mainly they're probably looking at a back fence back here. So when you're thinking about landscaping your home, plan on landscaping that back fence. Most people don't realize it, but all they do is a foundation planting back here against the house. So if you're inside your house and you're looking out the back windows or the back door, you know, you're not going to see what's next to the house. You're actually going to view out here back by that fence. So keep that in mind and plan for, maybe I should concentrate more plant material back here on this fence. Consider the traffic pattern, the circulation pattern of the landscape. How are you going to be traveling through this landscape? And it's not mainly just you. If you have pets, if you have children, grandchildren, what pathways are they going to take to get around this house? Maybe mainly to that door. So remember, if you have a dog that's going to run the fence every time because a neighbor has a dog, no matter what you plant here, it's going to be trampled by that dog. So maybe you need to plan on planting that plant material away from that fence about 3 feet, so there's room for that dog to run that fence, because it's going to happen every time. Another big thing, if you have a large lot, for people that are living in a city, maybe their lot is small, but if you have like a 2-acre or 3-acre or maybe a 5-acre lot, it can get quite overwhelming. So the main thing you want to do is maybe break those lots into smaller bite-sized chunks that won't be so overwhelming, but you'll have little miniature gardens in that landscape. And this is very important to do, because we don't want to become a chore. So it also helps, like if you have a large lot, you might want to phase it out with those different garden spots. So keep that in mind. What level of formality do you want? This is actually one of our projects, our sanctioned projects in Pulaski County. It's a historical site. This is Curran Hall. And what it is, back then, as you notice, this is a formal structure. And so the front part of this landscape, the viewing part of this landscape, is very formal. These are clipped boxwood hedges, and everything is more or less what's done to one side is planted, and it's the same on the other. So that is when I mentioned before about the viewing of your home. You want to match the landscape to the style of your home. As you realize, this is a formal, more or less colonial Greek structure, so it's going to be a formal type landscape that you're going to plan for. Now in the back, usually with all these landscapes, the back is more or less informal. It's loosey-goosey, it's free-flowing. Again, kind of match that with the style of your home. Okay, very important. When it comes to balance, symmetrical balance of the home, and as I mentioned before, for the formal landscape, what's on one side matches the other side. So if you have boxwoods on this side too, you're going to put 2 boxwoods on this side. So that is symmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance, you have plant material on both sides, but you're actually using the weight of the plant to balance out. So for instance, if you notice you have 2 boxwoods and a tree on this side, over here, you're actually planting 2 trees, but then you have boxwoods here. It's asymmetrical balance. You're doing it with a different style of plant material maybe, or you're doing it with a different number of plant material planted in it. You're still getting a balance, but it doesn't match each side. A simple landscape. It can be just a tree, a couple of boulders, and ground cover. As you look at this, this is just really simple. It's really easy on the eye, very pleasing, very low maintenance ground cover. And if this is your thing, if this is your style, maybe this is the way you should go to it. Again, very easy to read, and there's not really much to this landscape. When choosing plant material, we need to know how big is that plant material going to get. Scale is very important. You also need to know, is the plant deciduous? Does it lose its leaves every year? Does it shed? Is it evergreen? You know, it's going to retain leaves all winter long. So we need to make sure that we know the difference. And then another thing, is it a flowering tree or a flowering shrub? We're going to talk about specimen plants. We're going to talk about anchor plants and the difference. We're, again, whatever applies to trees applies to shrubs. We have deciduous shrubs that lose their leaves every winter, and then we have the evergreen shrubs that actually retain those leaves all year round. We're also going to talk about ground covers as it pertains to landscape. Later on in the session, we're going to cover ground covers and to use in the landscape, different types. On choosing plant material, again, it's very important that you know the maximum size that you need. So read that tag. Look how large that plant's going to get. And again, very important, sun versus shade. Certain plants are going to thrive in sun. Certain ones have to thrive in shade. You're also going to group plants with like needs. So if they have the same moisture needs, that's what you need to put in there. So usually the gray color foliage or the silvery gray foliage, they tend to like it on the dry side. Perfect examples of this: lavender, lamb's ear, wormwood, which is artemisias. Those tend to like it on the dry side. If you put them and give them a lot of moisture, you're probably going to rot them out. They hate those wet feet. They don't like a lot of moisture. You're also going to allow room for plants to grow. And the reason for this, have you ever lived in an addition and your neighbor built a new house, you leave and then you come back and it's fully landscape and all these plants are packed in there like sardines? Well, in about a year or two, they're going to be pulling plants out because those plants are actually growing into the other plants. And that's not allowing room for those plants to do well. So it's very important that you know how big that plant is going to get and plan for it. When you're doing a landscape, create a comfortable scale. You want to avoid those too crowded or too open exposures. And this goes back to what I talked about previously. You don't want to pack those plants in there. You want room for them to grow. You need to know the size they're going to get before they mature or as they mature. Trees can actually work for you in two ways. We plant trees for ornamental reasons, for blooming maybe, or we plant trees for shade, or we plant trees for screening. So again, use that to your advantage. A lot of people plant trees for that canopy cover. They actually use it to form a roof over an enclosing area, maybe making it a more intimate spot. So you can imagine if you plant trees close enough and their canopies touch each other, you're going to have a shady spot inside. Maybe that's a perfect place for a patio. But again, you can use them to your advantage. You also want to leave open spaces. And the reason for this, you want that viewing perspective through the landscape. And so if you leave open spaces, it's going to be more pleasurable to the eye. So as you're wandering through it, it's going to encourage that movement through the garden. You want to create a landscape plan that flows by grouping plants in beds. And when I say grouping plants, I mean doing groups of 3s and 5s. It's going to make more of an impact versus just a single plant of a single species. That's only going to be used when you're doing a specimen plant. That's usually larger. And again, I go back to being master gardeners, you want one of everything. But as far as that wow factor, if you start clumping stuff together into groups or beds, it's going to be more pleasing to the eye. It's also going to make a more of a wow factor. It's going to be easy to read too. So as you look through this landscape, look at this. You know, my father's, or my mother actually was guilty of this. She would plant stuff, you know, trees, shrubs, all over in the landscape. And so this gets to be a problem if the person mowing it, he has to mow around that. That's a landscape maintenance issue. So why not think about grouping that stuff into beds and actually have your planting beds here, and then you have your lawn or yard space here. So when it comes to mowing, you don't have to worry about mowing around each individual shrub. They're actually grouped in a bed, and it's going to be easier maintenance for the person maintaining that landscape. Plus, it's going to be more pleasing to the eye, and you're actually grouping plants together into beds for that pleasing viewing perspective. As I mentioned before, we want to encourage movement through that landscape. And this can be done with sidewalks or with pathways. Again, The sidewalks or pathways do not have to be concrete. They can be a number of things. We have mulch can be used as a pathway, gravel, stepping stones, anything that you can think of more or less can be used as a pathway. But the reason for this, if we don't have it, you're not going to encourage people to wander through the garden. That means you alone wandering through the garden. As far as viewing perspective, it will encourage movement through the garden because when they hit a pathway, it encourages them to follow that pathway to see what's on the other side. And so we want to encourage this movement through that landscape. Okay, we're going to talk about specimen plants and anchor plants. Specimen plants are plants that you want to stand out in the landscape. And they're going to be usually a limited number. That's the one that maybe you have one of or three of. But those are the ones that are the main attraction in the landscape. Then we're going to talk about anchor plants. When you're designing something, remember we talked about symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance? Well, to get that, we actually use anchor plants. And these are plants that are used to balance out or add weight to the landscape. So if you have a tree on one side and that tree is a pretty big tree and it's an evergreen tree, well, that's going to look heavy on that one side. So on the other side, you might have to plant 5 evergreen shrubs to help weight that out in the landscape. Some examples of each type: specimen plants. We use crepe myrtles quite a bit for specimen plants here actually everywhere across Arkansas. And again, they come in many shapes and sizes. So it's very important you know what size crepe myrtle you're getting, because you don't want to plant a crepe myrtle in the wrong spot because we don't want to encourage crepe murder. So again, make sure you know what type, what color, what size that crepe myrtle is going to get. But they're used quite a bit because they're one of those all-season plants. They have that nice bark on it in the wintertime. They also have, of course, when they bloom, that's what most people know them at. Many colors of bloom, that long season bloom. Plus, they also have beautiful fall foliage. And I have examples of pictures of this later on in the slideshow. Deciduous hollies is one of my favorite. It's one of those hollies. It's not a sticky holly, but it's a holly grown for its fruit or berry amount, meaning it's going to have all these red, yellow, orange berries. You can pick which color now you want. But then when the frost hits, it drops its leaves and all it's on it is just berries and the stems itself. It's very beautiful. A lot of people have deciduous hollies, plus they also have winterberry hollies, which is it's a shorter version of it, more of a stocky plant, but a very beautiful holly. Styrax. Styrax is one of my favorite trees or specimen plants. I like it. You can have it as a single stem, but I actually like it as a multi-trunk. It blooms, and once it blooms and it's pollinated, it makes this like egg drop fruit, which is another visual interest in the landscape. And I love mine. It looks like little eggs hanging from the tree after it blooms. It comes in white and a light pink. Very beautiful tree to have, ornamental tree. Hawthorn. And when I'm talking about hawthorn as a specimen plant, I'm talking about hawthorn, the standards that get tall. And it's actually grown usually as a multi-trunk, plus it also has a heavy fruit-bearing load. Another great one to have, and especially if you want to attract birds to your landscape, hawthorns are great. Sweetback magnolias. This is another magnolia, and a lot of people get them confused, but it's not that big dark green leaf magnolia. It's actually a gray-green, beautiful leaf magnolia. Again, it can be grown in a single stem, multi-trunk, but a lot of people plant this because it has a beautiful bloom, probably around June through July, and it smells like vanilla to me. It's a really clean smelling vanilla, fragrant. Very nice one to have. And I do like that leaf color and texture in the landscape. Redbud, everybody knows a redbud. They're common here in Arkansas. Again, many varieties out there. You can actually get a white blooming redbud, but again, many colors and types out there. There's also redbuds with purple leaves, redbuds with sun gold leaves. I mean, they've done a lot with redbud. Yaupon holly standard, and when I say standard, I'm talking about the miniature tree version of it, and it's usually grown as a multi-trunk, but I don't want you to get this confused with the yaupon shrub. They call them like pom-pom shrubs, an evergreen holly shrub. This is the bigger one, and I've got examples of this. Japanese maples are used all the time for specimen plants in the landscape. Many thousand varieties of Japanese maples out there. You can get the solid red leaves, you can get the green leaves. You can get a multicolored leaf Japanese maple now. The breeders have went crazy with this. So again, very important that you read that tag on that Japanese maple. Only certain ones will tolerate the heat here, especially in central Arkansas. So it's very important that you know where you're planting that Japanese maple. Now we're going to switch over to anchor plants. And on anchor plants, again, it's very important. Anchor plants, we're talking about weight. We're talking about that size and that weight of that plant. So you're using this as to scale out a plant, especially if you're doing asymmetrical planting. So Nellie Stevens hollies are used quite a bit. You know, they're going to get up to maybe 20 feet tall, but they more or less grow in a Christmas tree shape, and they grow down to the ground. And a lot of people plant these as screening, maybe to, you know, screen their neighbors, pool or private or public area. Also maybe screening, you know, if they have cars sitting on blocks, perfect shrub to use to screen it. They use it as a living fence. It also has a nice heavy fruit set. When I say fruit set, I'm talking about that berry set. Nice dark green color. Burford holly. And when it comes to Burford holly, pay attention to it because Burfords come in dwarf and they come into standard. And when I say dwarf, that doesn't mean 3 foot on a dwarf. That could be 6 foot for a dwarf, but that standard Burford's going to get like 20 foot. So again, pay attention to what you're getting on that shrub. Also, this is going to be a more rounded growing shrub or tree, depending on how you're going to use it in the landscape. Foster hollies is another one. They're used quite a bit. A lot of architects like using it because it's considered a layered holly. When you plant it, it's not really dense and thick unless you shear it, of course. But if you let it grow naturally, it's going to have different layers, and you can actually visibly see parts of your architecture through those layers. So a lot of people use that for that reason. Camellias, I love camellias. And you remember we had those fall blooming camellias and those spring blooming camellias. And you know, you need to know what you're looking for, because the fall are going to actually start blooming. Those fall blooming ones are going to start actually blooming like in October all the way through Christmas, maybe January. The japonicas are going to start probably blooming in February and on out. So again, pay attention to that. Usually the fall blooming ones have smaller, narrow leaves versus the japonica will have a larger bloom and a larger leaf. Little Jim Magnolia is one of my favorite magnolias. I actually use this quite a bit. I have one on my farm. I love it. It doesn't get out of hand. And when I say that, it doesn't get large. And I really like it because it's got a smaller leaf than the grandiflora, the big giant magnolia. And I love it. It actually, I think my Little Jim blooms more than the big grandiflora. And a great thing about this plant is if you like to decorate at the holiday time, it's a great one to snip off leaves for because they're smaller scale, easy to decorate with, and and they hold up very, very well. Viburnums. I encourage every landscape to have a viburnum. Many different types of viburnums out there. You can have deciduous viburnums. You can have evergreen viburnums. You can have blooming viburnums that have very fragrant blossoms. And you can also have viburnums that have a heavy fruit set or berry set. So when I say fruit, I'm really talking about the berries on it. So also those berries actually come in that red, and you can also get a bluish purple berry too variety. So again, viburnums are a very nice texture plant to have in the landscape. Arborvitaes. When I talk about Arborvitaes and Elaeagnus, those are the ones that either you love them or you hate them. I actually like them used in the right situation. Arborvitaes, again, pay attention to that tag to know what you're getting. We got Arborvitaes get big and round. They can get 20 foot in diameter. Then we have other ones like Emerald Green that can grow 15 foot tall but only get 3.5 foot wide. So pay attention to what you're getting. Elaeagnus, another one that's used quite a bit for screening and an anchor plant because it's a big rounded growing shrub. It's got a gray-green textured foliage. And the thing I like about Elaeagnus, it actually blooms in the fall. The blooms are inconspicuous, but its fragrance is wonderful. I love the smell of Elaeagnus when it blooms. I have to caution you, if you start pruning Elaeagnus, you're going to have to prune from then on because it's one of those shrubs I call it bad hair day or ugly hair day. It sends sprouts out everywhere, and either it's going to bother you and you have to go snip those off, or it's going to bother your neighbors and your neighbor's going to ask you to clip it because it's just going to have these little sprigs sprouting up everywhere. So, you know, plant it in the right spot where you're limiting the amount of pruning that you have to do on that plant. Some pictures of some specimen shrubs. As I mentioned before, This is a Japanese maple. Again, beautiful plant to have. Again, beautiful fall foliage, usually on these Japanese maples. But again, many different varieties out there. You can have short dissectums, which look like a squatty bonsai. You can go to a palmatum, which is a miniature tree size. Again, these are actually beautiful trees, and they add more or less like an architectural element to the landscape. Yaupon hollies. Remember there's a standard version, and it's usually grown as a multi-trunk. And then there's a short version, the little pom-pom shrub version of this. So make sure you know what you're going to get. And remember, on a holly, you have male plants and you have female plants. Only the females are going to produce a berry if she's pollinated. And so maybe on this plant, you want one that's not just evergreen, but it's going to have fruit on it too. So you might want to say, hey, I want to plant a female variety. I'm going to get that evergreen color. Plus, I'm going to get a heavy fruit set in that fall and winter, and it carries it over. And again, birds love this type of berry on these trees. Again, most people layer these up, and they keep these lower branches trimmed off and clean because it's used as more or less a small ornamental tree in the landscape. We talked about deciduous hollies. Remember, they're green most of the year, but in the fall when the frost hits, they drop their leaves, and then it's just all berries. I love this plant. It's one of my favorite ones. Now, these are actually grown as a standard. I like a multi-trunk. I like many trunks on mine. And again, beautiful plant. They also come in orange berry varieties, and they're also a yellow berry variety of this one out there. But a nice plant to have in a landscape, a nice specimen shrub to have in the landscape, and a nice plant to have if you're attracting birds to your landscape. Here we go to those anchor shrubs. And with anchor shrubs, we're talking about the weight of those shrubs. And again, arborvitae is used a lot. And a lot of people look at them and they start cringing because they hate them. But I actually like them because they are a great one to have for scale and balance in the landscape. They are a great one to have for screening in a landscape because they're very dense. And they're a great one to have because they are evergreen in the landscape. This is an example of a Burford holly. Again, they get large, but they grow more or less rounded version of it. But again, a nice one to have in a landscape. This is actually an emerald green arborvitae. Remember, we talked about the arborvitaes. Pay attention to the diameter of it. This one only gets 3.5, maybe 4, but mainly it maxes out at 3.5 foot diameter around. But it grows up like 15 feet tall. So it's like little green soldiers in a landscape. And a lot of people use this for screening because like between their driveway and the neighbors, they might not have enough room for it to grow out. And if you use this variety, it's going to grow out into the driveway. If you use this variety, it's going to stay in its confined space. So plan for that. Then we're going to talk about that little gem magnolia. This is, again, there's different types of magnolia out there. That grandiflora is going to have that big leaf. That little gem is going to have that smaller evergreen leaf. And I think mine's about 25 years old at the farm, and it's only mine maybe max out at 20 feet. It's a small variety. Again, it grows more or less Christmas tree shape. I let mine go to the ground because all magnolias are going to shed leaves, and I don't want to rake them up all the time. This way, if I let it go to the ground and it sheds, it's going to be hidden there until I get around to raking them up. Over here, we're going to have some either Foster hollies or a Nellie Stevens holly. Again, if it's Nellie Stevens, it's going to be very dense and thick. It's going to grow Christmas tree shape. It's also going to have a heavy fruit set on that shrub. Again, used for anchor plant, can be used for a specimen plant if you only have 1 or 2 in the landscape, but again, mainly used for screening. This is going to be very important when you're landscaping anything. We're going to talk about textured leaf landscape plants. And the reason for this, if you're driving down the street and you're looking at a landscape, when we talk about that visual view, that curb appeal, they're going to be looking against your house. Well, for instance, when we talk about textures, we don't want to put the same leaf type next to the same leaf type. It might be a different shrub, but it has the same leaf type and texture. Well, from the road, you're not going to know the difference. So why not do a combination? Why not take a tight leaf plant, for instance, that dwarf Hallorai holly? It's a small, tight leaf, and you're going to mix it with maiden grasses. And you know those maiden grasses are going to be that loosey-goosey grass blade. it's going to play off very well. You can read it from the street very well. Or if you're a house and you're looking at the back landscape, you can read it very well. Nandinas and junipers. Again, a lot of people hate nandinas. I like them. They're a durable one, and now there's all different kinds of varieties out there of nandinas. But again, nandinas had that loosey-goosey growth pattern. It's a cane-producing plant. You tie that to a juniper, you put a mass plant of nandinas next to a mass plant of junipers, they play well with each other. That juniper is going to be that nice evergreen type foliage. The nandina is going to be that loose foliage. And another thing about nandinas, you're going to get that nice color change, especially in the fall, because a lot of them usually change to a beautiful red or a purple color. Dwarf Indian hawthorns with lamb's ear. And again, I'm actually using the dwarf Indian hawthorn. You're going to get that nice evergreen foliage. You're also going to get that nice blooming in the spring on it. But next to that gray, soft lamb's ear, it's beautiful together. And again, dwarf Yaupon hollies. Again, this is the pom-pom one I call, because it more or less, there's no pruning to them. You plant them that look like little pom-poms planted in your landscape. A little evergreen pom-pom in your landscape. Again, slow growing variety, used in landscape quite a bit, but again, it's got a tight leaf. Plant it next to junipers, does well, it plays well with that. That leaf texture plays really well off of each other. Again, we go back to viburnums. Viburnums is one of those I think every landscape should have, because there's a wider range and variety of viburnums with junipers. Hostas with liriope, and I love this. Hosta is that large leaf, hosta, and then liriope, such as monkey grass, known as monkey grass, it's got that narrow blade leaf. And again, the one good thing about liriope, it's one of those ground covers that actually live in the sun or the shade. And with hostas, again, know what you're planting. Hostas more or less are regulated. They have to be in the shade. They are a shade-loving plant. So I have a picture of this, and you can see how well it plays with each other and how well it stands out. Knockout roses with grasses and juniper, great combinations. Ferns with hosta and dwarf mondo grass, very important on this. These are all shade-loving things, and they play well together. Large leaf azaleas with dwarf Halloran holly. That large leaf azalea plays really well off of that dwarf tight leaf of the holly. Color and texture in the garden. Again, I love blueberries. I have blueberries. Again, it's one of those all-season plants, and now it's really popular to plant food-producing plants into your ornamental landscape, because not only are they beautiful, you can actually start harvesting food off and eat it. And a blueberry is one of those plants, in the wintertime, it's got that multi-trunk, peeling bark. In the spring, it blooms beautifully, meaning it has those blooms that hang down, and they're just gorgeous. And then when they start putting on their leaves and their fruit, that fruit changes from a light green to a blush pink to a blue, and then they go to black. A nice ornamental feature to have in the garden. And if you don't want to pick them, don't worry about it. The birds will do it for you, because they also love blueberries. And again, we're going back to that movement now, planting food crops in with our ornamentals. Again, cabbage, a nice textured plant to have in the landscape. Cabbage has that big broad leaf. You can imagine planting that as a border, be beautiful. Plus you can also eat this, and it comes in, have you not seen the red cabbage? Beautiful color in the landscape. Broadleaves versus narrow leaves. And this is very important. And again, we're talking about how well these play with each other. See this liriope, this monkey grass? It's got that long blade. Look at it next to this hosta. Great thing. I mean, look at that broadleaf with this. It shows up in that landscape. So you can imagine if I did monkey grass next to daylilies, you won't be able to tell it. The only time you're going to tell the difference is when those daylilies are blooming. But when you plant a shade-loving hosta next to it, you know, it's going to stand out very well. This is lamb's ear. Again, it's that soft gray, light gray, green foliage. A nice perennial to have in the landscape. I love that larger leaf of it. And again, playing really well in this border because it's planted right next to a perennial salvia. Again, I love that purple bloom. I love that tight leaf of it. But again, it makes each of these plants stand out in the landscape. And notice we have a pumpkin vine growing in here. Again, if you've never grown a pumpkin vine, first of all, it has larger leaves, which is a nice textured plant, but it also blooms beautiful in the garden. And it's kind of neat scrolling through this border. I kind of like it. But one pumpkin seed goes a long way, so don't go crazy. Otherwise, you'll be shading out all your perennials if you're doing to do that. Okay, we talk about those textures again, and these are a few pictures of what we're going to talk about. For instance, this is that little dwarf Pennisetum grass. Nice fine grass foliage. I love this one in landscape use, clumping in landscape. Not only when it's blooming, that little plume on it, but what's really neat is when frost hits it, it turns this brown. And then lately, like when the frost actually gets into the plumes itself, it's like little crystals during those winter months. And again, a great one to have. Why not enjoy it when it's growing, but also enjoy it? It's got that winter interest in the fall and winter time. There's all kinds of spireas out there. There's the summer blooming, there's the spring blooming. Very important to know which type you're getting. Also in spireas, there's dwarf versions, there's standard versions, and that goes back to that size. Very important to realize which spirea you're getting. But the main thing is spireas are coming in many foliage leaf colors. And this is Aria, there's Lemon Mound, there's Lime Mound, which is a limey green. There's a chartreuse one out there. Again, when it's not blooming, you're having those leaf textures show up in the landscape. Plus, when it does bloom, you're getting double wow factor because it's blooms and the plant leaf color. Again, this is actually a small tight texture. This is actually a Vinca minor growing with monkey grass. Again, you can see there's a difference. They're both ground covers, but this has a tight little leaf. This has a long grass-like leaf. Again, grows very well. Now these are, again, as I mentioned, Liripe is one that you can use in the sun and the shade. So actually it helps you out a lot in the landscape. Plus, if you go over here, this is actually that tight little dwarf Halloran holly I was talking about. Nice little tight leaf. Used a lot in the landscape. We're going to talk about layering in the landscape because it's the most dwarf shrub that you can plant in the landscape. But this is actually next to some azaleas that are blooming. Now, we're going to go back to textures again, and one thing I'm going to ask you about this. I love this mixture, but I have to caution you. This is Equisetum, horsetail, very invasive. You're going to be cussing me if you plant this out in an open bed. This is actually planted with a concrete sidewalk surrounding it, and that concrete sidewalk's 5 foot wide. I do not want this stuff going crazy. I love it as a textured part in the landscape because it's actually a structured leaf in the landscape. And I think it's a neat plant to have. A lot of people have this in their water gardens too, but it does really well in the shade gardens, and it will take over. You need to contain it, meaning in a pot or surround it by concrete. But again, look how well it plays with this fern. Do you not notice that nice fernish foliage bouncing off or coming out between it? Beautiful plant to have in the landscape. But again, invasive, keep it contained. When I talked about winter interest a while ago on that Pennisetum, that fountain grass, well, here's actually a garden, a perennial garden that, you know, most people, when the frost hits, they go in and cut it out. Well, I don't like that because you're not looking at anything during the winter time. Here, I leave mine on all winter long. Birds will come and get the seed pods and stuff out of it. Plus, ice crystals will get in here, and it's still beautiful to look at. And then I come back in the middle of February and I clip this off and clean it up. But I want that visual interest all through the year, or I'm trying to maximize that visual interest in that landscape. So it's very important to look for that and maybe plan for that in your landscape. Crepe myrtle, this nice specimen shrub, used quite a bit in landscapes, used a lot. Again, I talked about its beautiful bark. Look at that cinnamon colored bark there and that mottling of the bark. And as they age, it just intensifies. So it's a great one to have. Look at this beautiful fall foliage that it has. Beautiful, beautiful plant. It's one of those all-season textured plants in the landscape. And of course, most people grow it for its blooms. Many, many colors it comes in. Many different sizes in it. Again, know what size you're planting. Again, very important, do not plant the crepe myrtle in the wrong spot, especially the wrong type, because we want to avoid crepe murder. Very important. Oak leaf hydrangea, another beautiful plant, all texture plant to have in the landscape. Now this is going to be regulated to the shade. And again, there's all different sizes of this. We have peewee, which is going to be the short one. it's only going to max out maybe at 3 foot tall. Then there's also the standard ones that are going to go way over my head, maybe even get 10 foot tall. But a nice all season landscape plant. In the spring, when it first lushes its leaves out and you get the nice blooms, notice that creamy green look that you get, and then it intensifies to a white. Then after it blooms and the blooms start fading, it more or less dries to this pale brownish like pink and cream, a nice fall look in the garden. Then when that's gone, look at the brilliant foliage that you get on it. It turns, this is actually Snow Queen, turns a brilliant burgundy color. Again, that is beautiful in the fall. And then in the winter, you're going to get this interesting peeling bark on this oak leaf hydrangea. Again, it's going to be regulated to the shade. Again, know where you're planting this plant. And again, know the size of this plant. So this all strings back to landscape plan. This is the reason for a plan. It helps you lay out and plan it, especially if you're not going to do it all at once. You can actually pick the plant material you're going to plant. Now, if it was me and I didn't have, for instance, this is a blank canvas and I was going to have trees in it, I would actually in phase one plant my bigger trees because I want them up and growing. Then I would start peeling in different areas of the landscape and start phasing it in. But the most important thing to think about, if I'm going to do any hardscape in this plan, decks, sidewalks, patios, fire pits, I might want to consider doing that first, because as you realize, it takes equipment to pour concrete. It takes forming, backhoes to maybe dig out pads for your patios. They're going to just run over your existing landscape. They're not, unless you move it and heal it in to replant it later. So maybe you want to plan for that as phase one. When laying out that plan, you can actually put it in on a, 11 by 17 will probably be the smallest amount you can do, but you can do it on a 24 by 36. Usually you can get, with an 1/8 inch scale, you can get it on a C size or a D size sheet of paper. And actually, if you can't, maybe, I know you can get the front lawn, you can break it up in section, front, back, and sides. And so usually when they do that, they do an 1/8 inch scale equals 1 foot. You're going to stake out the locations of the existing trees on that plan. You're going to stake out the locations of your new patios and sidewalks when you're planting. You're going to lay out that outside border of the landscape. And the easy way of doing this is I have an old water hose. And the reason for this, that water hose is flexible. I can shape it any way I want to, but the main thing about it is I can lay it out, I can look at it and see, hey, is this big enough? If not, I can move it very easy and then move it around to where you finally get to what you're looking for. And then after I do that, I just take that orange marking paint that you buy at Walmart or Home Depot or any of the box chain stores, and I actually spray paint that mark. Then it tells me where I need to dig that line for that border. Now, if it's in spring or summer months, you need to pay attention to the weed and existing grass in those areas. It's very important that you get rid of that. And that can either be done 2 different ways. If you want to do an organic way, you can smother it out with cardboard. If you want to do it with a herbicide, you can actually use a glyphosate on it and burn down that plant material. The main thing I want you to get out is Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is the antichrist in any landscape bed. If you have it in there to begin with, you're going to be fighting it from now on. Very important to do that. And with this in mind, remember, if it's in the fall and winter months and that Bermuda grass has gone dormant, it's already brown, no matter what you spray on it, you're not going to kill it. It has to be green if you're going to use an herbicide on it to kill it. So it's very important you pay attention to the timing that you're removing this weed or this grass. Okay, when you're laying out that plan, you're probably going to cover that area in approximately 6 inches of good pro mix and organic matter. Most of us are not blessed with a loamy, sandy, loamy soil everywhere around the landscape. I have rock where I live, and I have to actually add good soil to this to have the plants do well in it. You're going to place the plants in the correct location per plan, and this is going to be helpful because If you ever notice, if you don't have a plan, you're going to plant that plant, and then 2 years later, you're going to say, hey, I don't like where that plant is, and either you or your significant other's out there digging that plant up and moving it, and they're going to get tired of that. So let's plant it in the right place at the right time, and then we don't have to move it. It's going to be beneficial to you, your back, and also to the plant. When you're digging holes, you're going to plant that plant at the same depth that's grown in the container. And I do this except for azaleas and rhododendrons, because azaleas and rhododendrons hate wet feet. They're also a shallow rooting plant. So what I do is dig that hole half the size of the container. I score that root when I pull it out of the pot. We know not to plant those pots. We know to remove the pots before we plant the plant, but you want to score those roots. Otherwise, if you don't score those roots and cut those roots a little bit, those plants are still going to grow. Those roots are going to go around and around in that pot, and they're never going to know to expand out into the soil area. So we want to do that. But back to those azaleas and rhodos, if you plant them at half the depth and you rake up good soil to it, it's going to prevent you having a lot of those root-borne or soil-borne diseases rotting out those roots, Phytophthora, stuff that you mess with, because they want excellent drainage and excellent porous soil. Now, after you get through planting all those plants, you're going to water in all those newly installed plants. And it's very important because the water is going to help the soil settle around those roots. We don't want air pockets. It's just going to wick air to it, and you're going to start dehydrating those plants. So it's very important that you water it in to get the soil settled around those roots. Then you can cut a natural edge along the border of the landscape. And when I mean a natural edge, you're taking a shovel, you're digging a trench, a small trench around it, and that's the natural edge. Now you can border with metal edging, you can border with brick, you can border with rock. I mean, there's all kinds of edging out there, but remember, know what you're dealing with. If it's Bermuda grass, if your lawn is Bermuda grass and you're bordering Bermuda grass is either going to jump that curb or it's going to go underneath that. And this brings me to the next thing. I don't encourage using landscape weed barrier fabric around my landscape planting beds. And the reason for this, if you do a good job of prepping those beds beforehand, and then you're going to mulch those beds, you're going to keep a lot of this out. Plus, it's going to be better for the plants. But I can tell you from experience, Bermuda grass still grows underneath that weed barrier fabric. It also grows across the top of that weed barrier fabric, and it's a mess to get out. It's even double the amount of time digging it out. It's just a maintenance nightmare. So I don't encourage it. I encourage you to do a better job in prepping those beds where you don't have to use it. And your plants will do a lot better job growing. Now, I also love mulch. Mulching, you can never go wrong with mulching, because you need to add that 2 to 3 inches of mulch around those landscapes. It's going to conserve moisture. It's going to help keep down those weeds growing up. It's also going to help condition those plants to, is it hot outside? Is it cool outside? Depending on what time of the year it is, it's very beneficial. And the good thing about mulch, and if it's a natural mulch, it's going to break down and build up that soil. So it's actually going to be better for you to use a nice organic mulch that would actually break down and benefit the plant material. The next thing we hope to do is stand back and watch it grow. Now, when I talked about layering the plants, I mean, how do you see these plants? In layering, you need to realize, how large is that plant going to get? When I go by homes, when I'm driving by, and this is really from the street look, I'm looking at that house, and right next to that house, you might have a single row of shrubs. That's a foundation planting of shrubs. Why not come from that house? Of course, you can have that foundation planting, but why not put another row of shrubs in front of that, a different size? And then in front of that, maybe even a ground cover or even a dwarf perennial in front of that. So when you're actually looking at it, you're going to get more wow factor. You're going to get more of a texture in the landscape. You're going to get more visual interest in the landscape. So here in this picture, you can see the different levels. See this dwarf mondo grass? Then you go to the next level. Then you go to the next level. Those are the different layers in that landscape. And then here's a nice specimen. Actually, I think this is actually a crepe myrtle tree specimen shrub in the landscape. So you're actually using everything that we talked about in that landscape, and look how well that looks. You're getting a bigger bang for your buck when you do that. Now, If you're putting in an entirely new landscape and it's a blank canvas, you need to know the placement of the shrub. So you know to use maybe a larger shrub, maybe a 5-gallon shrub in the back, and then a 3-gallon shrub in front of that. And then you're going to go to a 1-gallon shrub in front of that. And then maybe a ground cover in front of that. And the reason for this, pay attention to those sizes. As it grows, it's going to stay in scale. So as it grows, the whole landscape looks really good. You're not going to have one of these shrubs outperforming the other in size or scale. Very important to do that. Very important to look at that size and shape of that shrub when you're planting it. A lot of us have fences and back walls in our landscape. Why not liven them up? Why not plant a vine or a shrub against it? You could do, I mean, you're looking out your back window and you're looking at that fence. This is actually a pyracantha. I love it. I mean, you can actually get this in orange, yellow, and red berries. Again, if you're a bird lover, you want to attract birds to the yard, beautiful plant to have in the landscape. But look how well that reads. You don't just have a foundation planting in front of that wall. You actually have another layer here, and it's like art on the wall. Speaking of art on the wall, a lot of people, we talked about growing fruits and vegetables in our landscape, so it's beneficial to us. Growing it, we're not just getting beauty, we're actually getting fruit. Why not espalier something on the wall? And when I say espalier, I'm talking about the art of actually pruning something to grow flat against the wall. Again, this is more maintenance in the landscape, and it's very important to pay attention to that. But again, it's like wall art. If you want to do it and you want to take the time to do it, it's great. And actually, any shrub tree can be espaliered, but it just takes that time to espalier. And it takes time to keep up with it as you go on in the years. But this is actually a fruit that's espaliered against the wall. And in the wintertime, you're going to just have the blank bare branches, which is beautiful. It's like art on the wall. Then when it leaves out and blooms, you're going to have the blooming of that. And then when it sets fruit, you're going to have fruit hanging off of it. Again, all year round, you're going to have something on that with this espalier. So if you don't have to espalier a lot, you might want to just espalier one thing on the wall itself. And again, the espalier doesn't have to have a wall. It can be on a trellis. It can be on wires, like a wire fence. You can do it many different ways. Another thing to add to the landscape for architectural interest and features are urns, or maybe a water feature, or maybe a sculpture of some sort. Again, this is great, especially if you're adding movement through the garden. You know, we talked about movement through the garden. Why not, like at the end of that sidewalk, you have a piece of sculpture there, or you have an urn there, or you have maybe a big planter there with seasonal color. You know, this is very important. So go ahead and add those architecturals in the garden to keep it interesting while you're walking through that garden. Remember, mass color makes a bigger impact. And if you're planting, you know, 3s and 5s, try to plant those 3 to 5s of the same color, because you're going to get that wow factor in that landscape. This is actually a watermelon red crepe myrtle. You can imagine, look how beautiful that is with all these bordering that. It's more prettier to have that same color than it would be to have one watermelon red, then a white, then maybe a pink. This way, you're getting that mass color. This way, it's making a bigger impact. We don't have to depend on flowers for that color impact. Why not go for leaf texture? Because, you know, most of the time, nothing's blooming constantly all year round. So why not play with Mother Nature? Use those leaves for your color. This is actually that crimson burgundy heuchera. Coral bells is a common name for it. Again, coral bells is one of those perennials that breeders have went wild with. Many color of leaf available on the market. It doesn't have it has a nice little delicate flower on it, but it's mainly grown for that herbaceous leaf foliage. Again, this is that burgundy one, a great one to have. But look at that leaf texture and color against that leaf texture and color of that Gold Mountain spirea. Again, when the spirea is not blooming, you still have that gold color, that leaf texture playing against this burgundy color leaf texture. And again, notice the width of this leaf versus the width of the leaf on this. Plays very well together, shows up very well together. Again, as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be blooming to have that impact. This is actually Gold Mountain spirea, again, planted in a clump. It's not just a single one. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. Again, look at that gold color against this burgundy color of this Japanese maple. Look at it against not just the leaf, look at it against this daylily. We have this blade, like grass blade length as this daylily playing against this tight compacted form of this. You can read this very well. Looks really good. This is very important. When I talked about when you're phasing out the landscape, this is actually construction of a site that I did. Can you imagine if you planted this with a landscape beforehand and then you decide to put a hot tub in or a little swimming pool in or a deck in? This is physically what happens to it. So if you know that you're going to do something like this, this might be something you want to consider phase 1 to do this, because again, you'll have to move that stuff and heal it in and tie it over and maintain it till the landscape is finished to reinstall. Otherwise, those construction workers are not going to worry about it. They're going to run over it and dig and just toss it to the side. This is actually, again, construction. This actually has pertained to irrigation system. This person is putting in an in-ground irrigation system. This is what's involved in it. So if in-ground irrigation system, is that something you think you're going to have? Maybe that's something you want to phase in at that beginning of the landscape, because they're going to have to cut trenches to lay those irrigation lines in. They're going to have to cut a trench to connect it to the electrical box. So again, pay attention to this. Not only to this, make sure before you do any landscaping, you call that dig number, because you're digging deep, and I don't want you, for safety reasons, get electrocuted, but also for cost reasons. If you hit a fiber optic line, it's going to cost megabucks to repair. Very important that you pay attention to that. Again, this is actually a little design I did for some clients, and what it is, there was nothing here in their backyard. Their backyard is where they spend most of their time. Remember, we talked about those private areas beforehand. They wanted to enhance that private area, and they wanted to do that with an arbor, you know, for shade, because it's actually on the west side. And when they come home in the evening, they're getting that hot sun. So we actually put in an arbor for that. We actually put in a fireplace so they can actually use this in the wintertime, but we put it in more or less like an outdoor living room. This extends their landscape from the house. They can look out the doors, the windows, and see it. Plus, they can also go all the way back to the back fence. This is what they're viewing out of their back windows. Again, very important. We are looking at that wall most of the time. We're not actually looking what's against the house, but we're looking back there on that wall. Why not enhance it? And I'm layering this too. See, I have short shrubs, medium size, and then I go to these tall shrubs. Again, I'm getting that visual interest. And again, pay attention to this structure and those leaf texture. This is actually fountain grass growing here next to these arborvitaes. They look really good against each other. You're getting that nice texture display against there. And architectural element. This is an armillary or a millary plane out there in the deal for interest. Again, this is on axis with their French doors. Again, they see that that's that architectural interest in that landscape. This is a little herb garden that I actually put in, but I copied this from a magazine design. But I put this in a little kitchen garden. And the reason for that, do a lot of grilling. So they wanted something to look good while it's growing. So we actually designed a little herb garden that they can actually do, and it looks good. If they didn't even want to use the herbs, we planned for it. Look at the different leaf textures in this. We have this actually, that burgundy purple basil next to, I think this is actually not sage, but oregano. And then you can see that little parsley in there. And then again, we use that rosemary, because actually rosemary is a nice evergreen herb that we can have in the landscape. And rosemary takes pruning pretty readily. So we actually use that for architectural interest in that little bed. Again, we're applying the same principles and rules to this. We're applying the scale of the plant. We're applying the color of the plant. We're applying that leaf shape and size of the plant. Plus, here's that other nice architectural element in that little garden area. And we're talking about the convenience of it. This is near their grilling section. So they can actually grill. They can go pick fresh herbs and actually use it in grilling. Plus, it's close enough to the kitchen. They can go outdoors and snip it easily, go back inside and cook with it. Again, planning stages of it. Remember, if you're planning for it, you're going to put this wall in first. And this is something to consider. If you're on a hillside or if you have to terrace, you know you're going to have to do something to hold in that solar mulch. So this is very important to plan for what you have to do ahead of time before you actually get something growing in that bed. Choose wisely, plan well, and hopefully your landscape will be a success. And this is my saying, a gardener is an artist that paints with a shovel instead of a brush.